There were reactions to Elizabeth's controversial religious settlement of 1559, and the first group that reacted are Puritans. And these guys are really, really extreme. They are Protestant, but they hold very anti-Catholic beliefs. Even though Elizabeth was a Protestant, she was by no means as far gone as Puritans. They had very strict views about the church in particular, and their beliefs are as follows. They believe, firstly, that the Bible and all services should be done completely in English. So if I put services, so church services in English. And the idea behind this is that any priest that are talking and giving their opinions across have to be doing it in English rather than in Latin, which is what the Catholics do. That's a guy talking on a pedestal. They believed that committees should be running churches, so ordinary people could gather together and discuss what they think about the church to help it run. So the church should be run by committees, and this is how you spell that, COMMITTEES, committees. And the idea here is that they would be selected and elected by churchgoers, and these committees would set the direction of the church. They wanted everything to be completely plain. They didn't want any stained glass windows. They didn't want any kind of candlesticks, as they thought that all these kind of changes, all of these kind of refinements were a very Catholic idea. So that's a candle there, obviously. This is a nice stained glass window, I think. Look at that. So all of these kind of stained glass windows, candlesticks, ornaments of any kind. So by candlesticks, I mean like the candle holders, the elaborate things. They believed that they should be removed. They didn't want any ornaments of any kind inside their churches, and they believed that priests should wear very plain robes, no colour, no light or anything to them, because they didn't want things to distract you from God. That's a very plain robe. Another thing they believe is that if it's not in the Bible, you shouldn't celebrate it, because the Bible is the Word of God. So if you're celebrating things to do with the Christian faith which are not in the Bible, then that is wrong to do. So one of the things they also disliked is Christmas, because Christmas is a festival that we all have, but it doesn't appear in the Bible. So the things that Puritans were happy about with the religious settlement is the fact that the Church of England was maintained as a Protestant church, which is an improvement from Mary I. However, they felt that the changes did not go far enough. So they're happy that it's Protestant, but they don't think it's gone far enough. They just want that extra push to make things far more extremely Protestant. The main Puritan challenge at this time came from mainly higher up bishops, kind of Puritan bishops, who felt that too much compromise had been made with the Catholics. So they wanted a more extreme Protestant service with churches even more plain than the religious settlement allowed. And it was not long before Puritan clergymen began to ignore and disobey the settlement. So the main two ways that Puritans disagreed with the religious settlement is kind of two controversies over mainly clothing and the appearance of things. The first is to do with crucifixes, and this becomes known as the crucifix controversy. Now, a crucifix is a cross which has kind of the image of Jesus dying on the cross. Now, Puritans thought that this crucifix represented an idol, a distraction from God, However, Elizabeth quite liked the familiar look of them. They'd been in churches, so she wanted to keep them. And she demanded that each church should display somewhere in it one of these crucifixes. When some of the bishops threatened to resign, the Queen did back down in this instance, because she didn't want to she couldn't afford to ignore the concerns, because there weren't quite enough Protestant clergymen to take any of their positions. If you remember from the last one, she had to replace bishops that refused to accept the settlement with Protestants. Some of them were Puritan. Nevertheless, she did keep the crucifix in the royal chapel. So she kept one in the royal chapel. That's supposed to be a crown. But she didn't enforce it in all the churches in the land because she had very few bishops that she could kind of replace the ones that resisted her with. So that is the first controversy, and you need to know it. It's known as the crucifix controversy, and that's the Puritan challenge over the crucifixes. The next controversy is known as the vestment controversy. Vestment controversy. And this is all about the clothing that the priests were supposed to wear. Puritans believed that priests should be seen as no different from anyone else. Therefore, they thought they should either have no special clothing at all, but if they did, then it should be very plain and simple. Whereas Elizabeth wanted priests to wear special vestments. It was becoming clear by 1565 that many of these kind of Puritan priests, not all the clergy, were wearing what the Queen had commanded, and some were not even following the instructions on how to conduct the service properly because they were disagreeing with elements of the religious settlement of 1559. So, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a man called Matthew Parker. And he was told to create a kind of, that's the best way to think about it, is like a very strange catwalk for priests, and they'd be kind of walking down in their little vestments. Here they are. So that everyone could have a look at what these were supposed to look like. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, arranged a special expedition in London to show what the vestments must be like. And the interesting evidence about this is that he invited 110 different members of the clergy, and only 37 refused to attend. So you've got 110 who were invited, but 37 refused to go. So it's fairly successful. They get quite a lot, but that suggests that there's 37 there out of that 110 who really passionately don't even want to go, and that's potentially what that could mean. He also, on top of this, produced a book of advertisements. So he produced a book of advertisements. Book of advertisements, got that scruffy, sorry. And this book of advertisements was supposed to be further guidance for priests to show them what Elizabeth wanted with the religious settlement. The Puritans were quite successful in some ways. They had two very prominent men who had the ear of Elizabeth, in particular the Earl of Leicester, who was Robert Dudley, of course, and Sir Francis Walsingham, They were both privy councillors. Earl Leicester was a privy councillor, and then they were both kind of raised up to being members of the Queen's Council. And they, amongst others, tried to persuade Elizabeth to make even more Puritan changes. Particularly through 1559 to 1563, bishops pushed for the removal of things that they felt were too Catholic. This included holy days, using the sign of the cross, organ music, and above all, they campaigned continually for the wearing of plain gowns. Elizabeth refused to agree to these demands, and by 1570, you had people who demanded further change being eventually imprisoned. That's supposed to be a ball of chain. Anyway, eventually getting imprisoned. So through the 1570s, Puritans who were demanding more, she kind of took a sterner stance and started arresting them. So that is religious settlement reactions for Puritans. Puritans, however, were probably not really a threat because they were quite divided. Some only wanted small changes like robes and such, whereas others wanted to get rid of a national church completely, so they didn't have like a single unified unit. And despite the differences, all Puritans agreed that it was better to have Elizabeth than a Catholic monarch. So even though they whinged and moaned a lot, they were generally, as a rule, supportive, and they would never have violent protest against it or help a foreign power invade. However, the second group that we need to look at are Catholics, and Catholics have far more potential to be a problem for Elizabeth. So we're going to look at Catholics in terms of their potential opposition. And there's some evidence first which is worthwhile looking at. In terms of numbers, there are far more Catholics than there are Puritans. And as a result, they could potentially be far more of a threat to her. Their numbers made them fairly important. You're talking mainly the most powerful noble families in the north of England. So the people who were predominantly, this is going to be England, there we go, look at that. The people who lived in the north of England, and the majority of the nobles there tended to be Catholic and remain Catholic even in the time of Mary I and straight through into Elizabeth. On top of that as well, there were around 8,000 clergy from Mary's reign that were quite clearly Catholics. They had been hosting different kind of Catholic services for the best part of 5 years. So they've been for 5 years under the reign of Mary, been hosting Catholic services, and it was still passionately supported, particularly in the north of England. Even though this is potentially a massive threat, mass opposition did not really occur, not in a way that it was feared might happen by particularly Puritans, and we need to look at why that is. So there are a number of things that made Catholics particularly unhappy, and the first thing to talk about is the fact that whereas Puritans thought that Elizabeth was far better than a potential Catholic on the throne, Catholics regarded her as being illegitimate for the reasons we've said before, and regarded Elizabeth as being kind of not fit to rule. Now, even further north in Scotland, there was a potential replacement to her, who was Mary, Queen of Scots, and the idea behind her is that if she could just get into England, she would be a viable option to replace Elizabeth and make the whole of England Catholic again. So that's a potential idea. But even though that was like a grand strategy that some Catholic nobles might have pushed for, It was more to do with the fines. So if you remember from the religious settlement, we were talking about the 1 shilling fine for people that refused to go to this new Protestant kind of church. And the people who could afford not to pay the shilling would decide that, this Protestant church is not for me, so I am not going to pay the fine and go. And these people, the people who would pay the fine and not go to church, were known as recusants. And these are people who are Catholic, they pay the money to not go to church, and usually they have mass in a private house led by a priest that is frequently hidden away. This was made worse somewhat when the Pope in 1566 ordered people ordered Catholics in England that they should not attend the Church of England. So in 1566 he orders them not to, even though there were penalties for those who did not conform on the odd occasion. They were genuinely not imposed by Elizabeth, the punishments. So I don't think she wanted to create a climate where Catholics felt that they were being kind of harshly treated. But there were punishments for repeat offenders, such as more fines, imprisonment, or loss of property, and they could at times lose their life if they continued to refuse to go to this Church of England. But the authorities in England tend to turn a blind eye. They prefer to ignore smaller examples of disobedience and not kind of shake the hornet's nest, because they knew how many Catholics there were and how much foreign powers like Spain and France might support them if there was too much persecution against the Catholics. There's evidence to suggest that she even made things a little bit easier for Catholics. She had, in, of course, 1559, so as this religious settlement was still going ahead, she had allowed ornate kind of vestments, so the gowns, she'd still allowed those. So you had colourful robes still in churches, Puritans of course hating that, but Catholics made up. And in 1560, even then, she still had, that's not right, in 1560, she still had the crucifix and candlesticks and rather Catholic looking things in her church, her private one. And there was this general feeling that if Catholics were outwardly loyal to her and attended the new church, which most did, then she would be quite happy with that, just be outwardly loyal. And foreign powers kind of didn't step in either. If they had have stepped in to support Catholics, it could have been different altogether. Even though that sounds brilliant, she wasn't able to get rid of the fear of Catholic invasion at any time. England did fear that they were surrounded. They had kind of France and Spain, and at any time those countries could potentially invade for religious reasons, in which case they might get the support of Catholics who lived in England already. Acts passed by Parliament after 1571. So 1571 Acts of Parliament were very hostile to Catholics. They identified active Catholics who were hostile to Elizabeth and the religious settlement as political traitors, and with that they brought in a death penalty for it, which suggests that they are taking things very, very seriously. If you are a Catholic and refusing the religious settlement, then you are a political kind of threat, is what Parliament's saying. And in total, you're talking about 200 Catholics who are executed throughout the whole of Elizabeth's reign.